The footsteps echoing across the wet sidewalks of Mayfair were actually the first sign of a great collapse. The man walking those streets was no ordinary person. He was Edmund Ashford, the Duke of Devonshire, one of the most powerful figures in the House of Lords, or at least he had been until yesterday. He pulled up the collar of his coat and stood there, completely soaked. In front of him rose the massive mansion that had once belonged to him. But there was a problem. The property was no longer his. The crumpled paper in his pocket screamed the truth in his lawyer's cold handwriting. "It's over, Edmund. You have nothing left." He took a step toward the door, then hesitated. He remembered exactly 3 years earlier. In front of this very door, he had erased a woman from his life with a single word. Without the slightest mercy, almost as if he were placing an old piece of furniture outside, not dismissing a human being. That woman was Eliza. And now, in one of fate's cruelest turns, while Edmund stood outside trembling in the rain, Eliza was inside, sitting beneath warm lights. He knocked on the door. Once. Twice. The door opened slightly. When the light fell across Edmund's tired face, the woman standing there looked straight at him. There was neither anger nor surprise in her eyes, only that familiar, unsettling understanding, as if Eliza had known, 3 years ago, that Edmund would end up here. The mighty Lord Ashford now stood speechless on the threshold of the woman he had once thrown out. So, how did things come to this point? How did one of England's most powerful men lose everything? And how did that quiet servant, Eliza, become the owner of that enormous mansion? Let's go back to the very beginning of the story. London knew Edmund Ashford as a lord, but no one knew Eliza. Because Eliza had not been shaped in London's glittering salons. She had been forged among the black coal dust of Wales. Merthyr Tydfil, Wales. A mining town where even the sky seemed stained a sooty gray, a place where the sun sometimes felt forgotten. People there were divided into two kinds, those who spent their lives underground and those who waited for them above. Eliza's father, Thomas, was one of the men working in those mines. His body might have been trapped underground during the day, but in the evenings, he escaped into books by candlelight. When Eliza was still a child, he gave her a lesson she would never forget. "My daughter, they can control your body, but never your mind. Not unless you let them." Eliza engraved those words in her heart like a seal. Her mother, Sarah, was the quiet strength of the family. A woman who worked without complaint, revealing her exhaustion only in the few minutes when she rested her head on the table. From her mother, Eliza learned patience. From her father, she learned how to think. At 9 years old, she lost her mother to tuberculosis. By 18, her father began losing his battle with the lung-rotting illness common among miners. At that age, Eliza understood something important. The people in that town were not stupid. They simply had no opportunities. A quiet but deep anger, the anger of refusing to let the place you were born become the ceiling of your life, pushed Eliza to act. A job posting from London would change everything. They were looking for a maid in Mayfair. When she said goodbye to her father at the train station, Thomas leaned in and whispered one last thing into her ear. "London will try to change you. Don't let it. And for now, keep what you've learned to yourself." When Eliza boarded the train, she carried more than 3 dresses, 2 books, and her mother's sewing needle. She carried a patient and razor-sharp mind, one capable of bringing even London's richest men to their knees. She would look ordinary. She would remain quiet, but she would notice everything. So what was waiting for this quiet servant when she first stepped into Lord Ashford's mansion? What would happen when that towering arrogance collided with Eliza's intelligence? Now let's turn the coin and look at the other side. Edmund Ashford. It's easy to label him the villain, isn't it? A wealthy, arrogant aristocrat who threw a woman out of his house. But real stories are never that black and white. Edmund Ashford was not a bad man. He was simply a man who had never been questioned. And like anyone who is never questioned, he had slowly turned into an enormous title that was completely hollow inside. Devonshire, southern England, windy coastlines, and a vast estate where the name Ashford had been carved into stone for centuries. Edmund was born into that world. As a baby, everything he wanted appeared before him without the need to cry. It wasn't arrogance. For him, it was simply normal, as natural as gravity, as natural as the sunrise. His father taught him everything: how to ride horses, how to speak Latin, how to command a room full of people. But he forgot to teach him one thing: the enormous difference between earning something and merely owning it. At Oxford, Edmund studied history. He examined how great empires collapsed. But he always looked from above. He never saw the people below who carried those empires on their shoulders. When his father died, he was not even allowed to mourn. "Don't cry, Edmund. You are the Duke of Devonshire now." From that day on, Edmund put on the mask of the Duke every morning like a costume. Invitations, investments, polite smiles. But at night, when he lay his head on the pillow, he felt a strange unease he could never explain to anyone, because he didn't know the language for it. Until that morning at breakfast. Edmund sat at the table, speaking with his usual arrogance while reading the newspaper, confidently commenting on something he had misunderstood. No one could correct him, right? He was a duke. But the maid walking through the room, the one with the Welsh accent, Eliza. She stopped. Edmund felt a strange impulse and asked, "Do you have something to say?" Eliza turned around. There was no fear in her eyes, no submission either. With just 2 sentences, she dismantled the argument the mighty Duke had been defending. The sound of silver spoons on the table stopped. Everyone froze. At that moment, something that had been asleep inside Edmund for years finally stirred. Not anger, curiosity. For the first time in his life, someone had looked at him not as the Duke, but as a man who could be wrong. From that second on, nothing would ever be the same. So how did this small spark turn into a raging fire? Why did Edmund become so afraid of Eliza's intelligence, and why did he eventually throw her out? When Eliza first stepped into Ashford Mansion, it was 8 o'clock in the morning. One of those cold November mornings when the damp air seems to seep straight into your bones. Even at that hour, Mayfair had its own quiet dignity. The sound of horse hooves echoing through the streets, the distant slam of a door. Everything felt controlled, as if even the streets themselves knew they were not supposed to be loud. Eliza entered through the back door. This was the first unwritten rule. Servants always used the back door. The front door belonged to the masters, to that other world. The back door, the kitchen corridors, the narrow staircases, that was the servants' world. The architecture of existing without being seen. The person who greeted her was Mrs. Howell, the housekeeper. A stern-faced woman nearing 60, her gray hair tied tightly in a bun at the back of her head. She had spent decades in this profession. She had seen hundreds of servants, and all those years had taught her one simple thing. You could tell what someone truly was from the very first day. Mrs. Howell looked Eliza up and down. Her dress was simple but spotless. Her posture was upright, neither a timid retreat nor a bold step forward. But it was her eyes that stood out the most. Her eyes weren't fixed on the floor. That caught Mrs. Howell's attention immediately. Most maid applicants were either nervous or strangely careless. But this woman was different. She was simply there, as if she knew exactly where she stood. "From Wales, are you?" Mrs. Howell said, catching the accent right away. "Yes, ma'am." "Have you ever worked in a house this large before?" Eliza hesitated for a moment, but she didn't lie. Not one this large. But I'll learn. Mrs. Howell raised an eyebrow. Most applicants would either give an exaggerated yes or a timid, apologetic no. Eliza's answer was simple, honest. You don't have much of a luxury for learning here, Mrs. Howell said. But we'll see. During the first week, Eliza was like a ghost, quiet. She followed her father's advice. Observe, learn, but don't be seen yet. She woke before dawn, lit the fireplaces, helped prepare breakfast, cleaned the rooms, and worked until nearly midnight. Her body was exhausted, but her mind never stopped. She recorded everything, the order of the house, who went where, how one was supposed to walk in certain rooms, what angered Mrs. Howell and what she tolerated. She memorized it all. At first, the other servants kept their distance. As they did with every newcomer, they tested her. But Eliza didn't try to win anyone over, and she didn't withdraw into herself either. During evening meals, she listened to them, laughed at their jokes, and quietly helped when someone was overwhelmed with work. Within a week, without forcing it, simply by being herself, she had carved out a place for herself in that kitchen. And Edmund Ashford, the master of the house. Eliza barely saw him during that first week. The system was designed that way. The Duke woke late, went to his club, attended social events. When he was present, the servants were supposed to be invisible. When he was gone, they were everywhere. The two worlds were not meant to meet. But on the 8th day, that system would crack. It was breakfast, the large dining room. Edmund sat at the head of the table with his newspaper. Across from him was a guest visiting London that week, Lord Hargreaves, a middle-aged man with a round belly and a voice far louder than necessary. Eliza was in the room, serving. Coffee. Bread. Butter. She moved with those automatic gestures required to remain invisible. Quiet steps. Zero eye contact. Hargreaves talked endlessly. He was describing a new railway investment in India. Numbers were flying through the air, projections being made. Edmund listened silently and nodded along. Then Hargreaves said something. He made a comment about the productivity of local workers in Bengal. He gave a number. But the number was wrong. Not just slightly wrong, fundamentally wrong. Eliza had read about it in her father's books back in Wales. She practically knew the railway reports from India by heart. The real figures were entirely different. Hargreaves was either ignorant or manipulating the numbers. When Edmund repeated the incorrect figure in agreement, Eliza had already finished serving the coffee and was heading toward the door. But she stopped. Even she might not have known why she stopped. Maybe it was that old anger she felt toward injustice. Maybe it was the memory of her father. Or maybe she simply couldn't tolerate hearing something that was clearly wrong. She slowly turned. "Excuse me." Her voice was calm, but the air in the room froze instantly. Hargreaves fell silent. His assistant lifted his head. Edmund lowered his newspaper. 3 men were now staring at a Welsh-accented maid who had arrived only 8 days ago. They didn't even know her name. But Eliza didn't step back. "That number isn't correct, sir," she said. The daily labor productivity during the Bengal railway construction was nearly twice what Lord Hargreaves mentioned. It's clearly documented in the 1882 Indian Administrative Report. If you base the investment calculation on that figure, the results will be misleading. Can you imagine the silence in that room? Even the faint clinking of porcelain stopped. In the morning light filtering through the curtains, Hargreaves's mouth hung open in shock. Edmund Ashford looked at Eliza, but this time he really looked. Perhaps for the first time in his life, he actually saw a servant. A few seconds passed. Then Hargreaves let out one of those forced, condescending laughs. "Is your maid debating with you, Ashford? Really?" What he meant was clear. Put her in her place. Throw her out. That was what the system demanded. Edmund was supposed to laugh it off and dismiss Eliza immediately. Edmund laughed, but not at Hargreaves. It was a quiet, almost private smile. Then he turned to Eliza. "Are you certain about your source?" Eliza didn't hesitate for even a second. "Yes, sir." Edmund inclined his head slightly and turned back to his guest. "Then let's have the numbers verified. Please, continue." Hargreaves turned bright red. Eliza calmly left the room. When she stepped into the corridor, she realized her hands were trembling. But it wasn't fear. It was that strange rush of adrenaline that comes from breaking a great silence. Edmund hadn't fired her, and yet the system demanded that she be fired. That afternoon, Mrs. Howell summoned her. "Do you realize what you did this morning?" "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Howell studied Eliza's face for a long moment. Behind her stern gaze, there was something else now, something deeper than anger. "Don't do it again," she finally said. "If you do, I'll dismiss you myself. Don't wait for the Duke." As Eliza walked out the door, Mrs. Howell added quietly behind her, "And if that number really was correct, well done." That night, Edmund Ashford didn't go to his club. He shut himself in his study. He spread the 1882 report across his desk, the one he had specifically requested from the library. He checked the numbers one by one. The Maid was right. He stared at the report's cover for a long time, then looked out toward the rainy London street. One question passed through his mind. Who is this woman? And that day, something invisible, but very real, began between the two people living in that mansion. It wasn't friendship, wasn't hostility either. It was something far more dangerous. They had begun to see each other. In the days that followed, a strange balance formed within the mansion. On the surface, on paper, nothing had changed. Eliza still woke at dawn, carried the heavy burden of work, and collapsed into bed, exhausted near midnight. Edmund remained trapped in London's glittering but empty social calendar. Meetings, endless invitations, long hours at the club. They lived under the same vast roof, yet in entirely different universes. The system continued turning its gears. But just beneath the surface, something had begun to move. Something subtle, quiet, almost tangible. Both of them were aware of it, even if they couldn't admit it to each other, even if they were afraid to admit it to themselves. Edmund's change appeared first in small details. During breakfast, while reading the newspaper, he no longer just read. Occasionally, he began thinking out loud. He wasn't addressing anyone in particular. He simply released his thoughts into the air. But he knew that if Eliza was in the room, and she usually was, those thoughts had a destination. At first, Eliza didn't take the bait. She acted as if she hadn't heard, because the rule of the system was clear. A servant doesn't hear. A servant doesn't know. A servant does not exist. But one morning, Edmund stepped on a fault line. He was talking about a new bill being debated in Parliament, one concerning miners' working hours. Edmund made one of those icy, know-it-all remarks of his, the kind that sounded informed from the outside, but carried no trace of real life within it. Eliza had just been setting down a coffee cup when she stopped. Her hands hung in the air. Edmund looked up. His eyes were on Eliza, as if he had been waiting for that reaction, for that pause. "Is there something you want to say?" Edmund asked. Eliza waited for a second. She held her breath, and then she spoke directly. Short, clear, almost like a slap. She said that miners worked 14 hours a day in that darkness, that lung disease tore those men away before they even reached 40. She said the law looked good on paper, but deep down in those pits, it meant nothing in real life. Just 2 sentences. Then she left the room without looking back. Do you know what happened that same afternoon? Edmund wrote a letter to his contacts in Parliament. He asked about the implementation details of the bill, the practical, real-world parts he had never cared to ask about before. He couldn't fully explain why he did it. That was how the weeks passed. Small moments, short but sharp sentences. Most of the time, Eliza would leave a single sentence behind as she exited the room, and Edmund would be left alone with the weight of it. Edmund was beginning to notice something. Everyone around him looked at him through the same mask. Lords, friends, lawyers. They all saw the Duke of Ashford standing before them. The title came first, the man second. No one debated his ideas. No one questioned his decisions. Everyone said, yes. Once that sense of power had comforted him, but now that costume of the Duke was beginning to feel heavy. The unease he felt when he was alone at night was growing. The gap between the Edmund people saw and the real Edmund was turning into a chasm. But Eliza, there was something different in Eliza's eyes. This wasn't yet a love story. Edmund did not think of it that way. But he knew one thing. When Eliza looked at him, she did not see that grand title. Or perhaps she did, but she did not care about it in the slightest. Eliza looked straight inside. Her eyes weighed him, measured him, pierced through that false shell. That gaze both drew Edmund toward her and unsettled him to his core. Because being seen was dangerous. If you let someone look inside you, the empty spaces there would become visible too. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Edmund was buried in financial papers in his study. Estate documents, reports that had not been properly reviewed in years. A tangled mess of numbers that never quite matched, even though the lawyer always said, "Everything is in order." Eliza entered the room to dust, again with those quiet, ghost-like steps. Edmund stared at the papers for a while, then set down his pen. He turned toward the window, toward the gray world outside. "What was your father's profession?" he asked suddenly. It sounded like a question, but it still carried the tone of a duke used to giving orders. Eliza stopped the cloth in her hand. She had not expected that. "He was a miner, sir." "In Wales?" "Yes." There was a pause. Edmund kept looking outside. "Does he still work?" "He's ill. He can't work anymore." Edmund said nothing, but he lowered his head slightly. It was hard to tell whether that was gratitude or acceptance. Eliza was about to return to her work when Edmund spoke again. But this time, it sounded less like he was speaking to Eliza, and more like he was asking his own soul. A man spends his whole life inside a pit. Then he falls ill. And the man who owns that pit sits here in London, looking over these accounts. He stopped. At that moment, Eliza turned and really looked at Edmund. For the first time, it was this bare, this direct. "And what does that man feel?" Eliza asked. Her voice was soft, but the question was as sharp as a blade. Edmund did not answer. But sometimes, silence is the deepest answer of all. That was the moment Eliza discovered something too. She had been watching this man for days, and beneath the arrogant aristocrat she had expected to find, she found something else. A terrible loneliness. But it was not the kind of loneliness Eliza knew. Her father's loneliness had been born from a world that kept shutting its doors on him. Edmund's loneliness was his own creation. He had laid each brick of that arrogance with his own hands, placed each stone of those distances himself. And now he sat alone in the middle of those enormous walls. There were hundreds of people around him, yet no one was truly there. Because Edmund never let anyone come close. If they came too close, they would see the emptiness. When Eliza understood that, she found a name for the feeling rising inside her. It was not pity. Eliza never looked down on anyone, nor up at them. It was recognition. "I see you," she thought. "Not what you say. not the false grandeur you put on display. I see who you really are. And that feeling of recognition, that was very dangerous. Because once you truly see someone, you can no longer remain indifferent to them. Two other important things happened that week. The first, Edmund had new books brought into the library: history, economics, industrial reports. As Eliza placed them on the shelves, she read the titles and noticed something. All of these books told the story of the world from below, through the eyes of workers and change. Edmund had started reading her world. The second. One evening, Edmund returned from his club earlier than usual. In the dim light of the kitchen corridor, he and Eliza came face to face. An unexpected meeting, a meeting against the rules of the system. They both froze for a moment. Edmund was supposed to keep walking. The system demanded it. But he stopped. "Do you still remember that 1882 report?" he asked. "Yes, sir." "What else have you read about conditions in India?" Eliza hesitated for a moment, then answered, "A few things. But from sources that aren't in this mansion's library." Edmund lowered his head. "Make a list tomorrow morning. We'll have them brought in." Then he climbed the stairs without looking back. Eliza remained there in the dim corridor, a candle in her hand, frozen in place. She was going to make a list. The books would arrive. And about those books, perhaps they would talk. The system did not allow for that. But the system was starting to crack. That night, Eliza could not sleep. Her father's last words echoed in her mind. "London will try to change you. Don't let it." Eliza asked herself, this thing she was living through, this dangerous closeness, was that what changing meant? She did not know the answer. She knew only one thing. Within the walls of that mansion, something was changing in a way that could not be undone. And that change would not affect only one side. The storm was coming. Near the end of November, an unexpected guest arrived at Ashford Mansion, Lady Margaret Ashford. She had not sent word ahead, because giving notice meant giving the other side time to prepare, and Lady Margaret never gave anyone that advantage. She stepped down from her private carriage from Devonshire and glided through the doors of the mansion with that icy elegance of hers. When Edmund heard his mother's sharp, commanding voice outside his study, he felt his shoulders tense without meaning to. "Edmund!" The voice had arrived before the door even opened. Lady Ashford was 62 years old, but she was not an old woman. She was a hardened one. The years had not softened her. They had sharpened her, crystallized her. She loved Edmund, yes, but her love could never be separated from her loyalty to the Ashford name. She loved the Duke first, her son second. Lady Ashford sat down in the chair, slowly removed her gloves, and looked at him. "So you've been here for 2 weeks," she said. It was not a question. It was a statement. She did not like circling around a subject. One by one, she laid everything on the table. The lunch with Lord Hargreaves, the famous breakfast scene, the gossip spreading through the house about the Duke reading books with a maid. "A maid," Lady Ashford said. Her voice was neutral, but her words were heavy as lead. "A maid argues with you at your own table, and instead of dismissing her, you decide she's right." "Because she was right, Mother." "That is completely irrelevant, Edmund." Lady Ashford's eyes narrowed. Her voice dropped lower. The most dangerous moment. "Hargreaves isn't the only one talking. They're discussing it at the club. That you spend time with a servant in your own house. That you discuss philosophy with her in the mornings. It doesn't matter if it's nonsense. What matters is that people are talking." Lady Ashford stood up and delivered the final blow. Charlotte, the daughter of Viscount Pemberton. The right lineage, the right education, the proper character. There would be a dinner at Christmas, and Edmund would attend. And this inappropriate situation in the house would end immediately. That night, Edmund did not sleep. He sat for hours in the dark room, in front of the extinguished fireplace. His mother's words were not new. The system had been whispering the same things to him every day. What truly unsettled him was Eliza's face, that honest, unmasked gaze. And that night, Edmund Ashford admitted something to himself. Fear had won. Because being seen, truly seen in all your nakedness, was dangerous. He was not yet ready to face the emptiness inside him. Perhaps he never would be. At first light, he sent Eliza a short, cold message. "I would like to see you in the study." When Eliza entered, Edmund was standing behind his desk. He had not sat down. Standing meant distance, authority. He did not even look at her. "Eliza," he said. He used her name, but this time it sounded cold, like a sign placed at the edge of a cliff. "Your services have been satisfactory, but the needs of the household are changing. I will not be able to keep you any longer." That was all. Just that. Eliza stood still for a moment. She looked at Edmund, truly looked at him. But there was no hurt in her gaze, no surprise either. Since Lady Ashford's arrival, she had already known this moment was coming. When she had seen the light in Edmund's room, burning late into the night, she had already read this farewell. Edmund avoided her eyes and turned toward the window. He muttered something about Mrs. Howell preparing a reference and arranging her compensation. "That won't be necessary," Eliza said. Her voice did not tremble. Perhaps something inside her was breaking apart, but not a single crack showed on the surface. "I understand, Lord Ashford," she said calmly. She paused for a moment. The air in the room grew heavy. "I hope that one day you understand yourself as well." Eliza turned and walked toward the door. Edmund could have said something. There was still time. He could have said, "Stop." He could have said, "I'm sorry." One single word could have been enough to destroy the system. He said nothing. The door closed. Eliza stopped in the corridor. She felt the sharp tightness in her chest. She didn't run from it. She didn't suppress it. She had learned from her father how to carry her emotions. She took a deep breath and went to her room to pack her suitcase. 3 dresses, 2 books from her father, her mother's needle. She was leaving exactly the way she had arrived, but the woman who left was not the same woman who had come. The woman who arrived had known what she wanted. The woman who left now knew exactly what she would never accept again. And that was the greatest power in the world. Edmund remained in that room alone, surrounded by the books he had ordered from Eliza's list, books whose covers he had not even opened yet. Eliza's final sentence echoed in the room. "I hope that one day you understand yourself." Outside, London's endless rain had begun. Ashford Mansion was as quiet as ever. But this time, that silence sounded like the echo of a vast emptiness. Let me ask you something. What does a woman do when she is thrown out of a mansion with a single suitcase and a few coins in her pocket? It was London in 1888. Freezing rain outside. Most women would either give up and return to their village or fall to their knees and beg to be taken back. Eliza did neither. The moment the door closed behind her, she walked away without looking back even once. The first thing Eliza needed was a place to stay. Her life in Mayfair's luxurious streets was over. She rented a bed in a women's boarding house in the back alleys of Whitechapel, paying only a few shillings a week. The room was tiny. A bed, a table, a window. When she looked outside that window, she no longer saw dukes. She saw tired workers walking to their jobs before sunrise. On the second night, she opened her suitcase. She placed her father's books on the table, picked up a pen, and began making calculations. How much was the rent? How much would food cost? How much could she save each month? She wrestled with numbers until morning. Her plan was clear. She would not stop. 3 months later, we find Eliza in a small tailor shop in Soho. Her employer, Mrs. Bernard, was an old-school, tough woman. Eliza simply said, "Give me the fabric and see what I can do." She got the job. But Eliza didn't just sew there. Her eyes were always on the ledgers. Where did the fabric come from? Who bought it? And at what price? What were customers willing to pay for? Within a year, Eliza knew every detail of that shop, as if it were the palm of her hand. Eventually, she went to her employer and said, "If we buy directly from the factory in Manchester and remove the middleman, our profit will increase by 30%. She convinced other shops as well, and sat down at the negotiation table with the factory. She may not have made much money from it, but her name began to spread. The Welsh woman with a sharp head for numbers. 2 years passed. Eliza lived frugally, filled her stomach with the cheapest vegetables she could find, and saved every coin she could. With the money she had saved, she rented a small ground-floor space in Clerkenwell, and she hung a sign on the door. E. Morgan, tailoring and textile supply. She hired 2 workers and paid them above the market rate. "If you pay people well, they take ownership of their work," she used to say. At first, business was difficult. There were nights when she couldn't sleep because the rent was overdue. But she didn't give up. Then one day, the owner of that massive factory in Manchester, Harold Whitmore, became curious about this tough woman everyone was talking about and came to London to meet her. They talked for 2 hours. Eliza didn't tell him about dreams. She showed him numbers, export plans, the gap in the ready-to-wear clothing market. Whitmore was convinced. They signed a major agreement. The workshop expanded. She rented the floor above as well. That small sign on the door became a large plaque. Morgan Workshop. In those 3 years, Eliza learned one thing very clearly. If you're a woman, doors close twice as hard. Banks demand a male guarantor. Customers try to force prices down. Every time, Eliza knew when to stand up and walk away from the table, because she understood something simple. In the end, everyone speaks the same language: money. By 1891, Eliza Morgan was a businesswoman standing firmly on her own feet. No debts, no obligations. She might not have been invited to the Duke's dinners, but she was now part of the same commercial network even Dukes depended on. And then the news arrived. That great mansion in Mayfair, Ashford Mansion, was up for sale. The old family had fallen deep into debt, and the lawyers were urgently searching for a buyer. Eliza placed the numbers in front of her. She shook hands with her partner, Whitmore. November 1891, another rainy day in London. Eliza sat in that familiar, enormous room, lawyers across from her. 3 years earlier, she had been thrown out of that house. Now she sat at the head of the table. She picked up the pen and signed the paper. The mansion was now hers. Those giant iron gates, those stone columns, everything was the same. But this time, Eliza wasn't there as a servant. She was there as the owner. And at that very moment, outside in the rain, a man was walking slowly toward the house, looking up at the lights of the mansion. Edmund Ashford's world had not collapsed overnight. It fell slowly, quietly. Each morning, everything looked the same. The mansion still stood. His title still remained. But with every passing day, something else disappeared. At the end of 1889, when the family lawyer Pemberton placed the documents on the table, the truth struck him like a blow. The Ashford family was drowning in debt. For years, they had ignored the debts left behind by his father. The luxurious life had continued, but the treasury was empty. The lawyer spoke plainly. "If you don't sell this house, you will be ruined within 2 years." After that, everything unraveled quickly. Charlotte, the wealthy bride his mother had chosen for him, heard the rumors about the debts and disappeared without looking back. Lady Ashford simply said, "Find a solution," and retreated to Devonshire as if fleeing. Edmund was completely alone. Then the letter arrived. There was a serious buyer for Ashford Mansion, Morgan Workshop, on behalf of E. Morgan. Edmund stared at the name for several minutes. Eliza Morgan. The servant he had thrown out 3 years ago was now buying his house. Did Eliza have to buy this house? No. Were there other properties in London? Of course there were. But she chose this one. Was it revenge? Probably not. Maybe she simply wanted to carve her own name into the walls where she had once been wronged. To say, "I am here." Edmund asked for a meeting. Eliza made him wait. Thursday, 3 o'clock. Edmund arrived at 2. Now he was the one waiting. When he entered the house, everything looked the same, but the balance of power had completely changed. When Eliza descended the staircase, Edmund stood up instinctively. Once he would never have stood for a servant. Now he stood for the lady of the house. Eliza had changed. She had not hardened, but she looked complete. A high-quality dress she had made herself, hands shaped by work, but steady and confident. "Lord Ashford," Eliza said. "Miss Morgan," Edmund managed to reply. His voice trembled. They sat down. Edmund had come with a business proposal. He suggested building a joint manufacturing facility on the land of the estate. He spoke at length about numbers and strategy. Eliza listened quietly. When he finished, she asked only one question. "Why are you doing this?" Edmund tried to answer again with numbers, but Eliza stopped him. "That's not what I asked," she said. "Why are you here?" At that moment, the great Duke's mask fell to the floor. He had nowhere left to hide. "Because I made a mistake," he said quietly. 3 years ago I made a terrible mistake. I want to apologize." The room fell silent. Only the sound of rain outside could be heard. Eliza looked at him for a long time, with those same eyes, the ones that truly see. "I heard your apology," she said, "and I accept it. I'll consider your proposal as well. The numbers make sense. I'll let you know in a week." The meeting was over. As Edmund stood to leave, he remembered the words Eliza had spoken at the door 3 years earlier. "I hope you understand yourself someday." "Did you understand yourself at least?" Eliza asked. "I've begun to," Edmund said honestly. "It's not finished yet, but it's begun." A faint smile appeared on Eliza's face. "That's enough," she said. As Edmund stepped outside the mansion, he paused on the stairs. In the rain, he looked back at the huge building one last time. The house was no longer his. But strangely, for the first time, the heavy Duke's costume was no longer weighing on his shoulders. Perhaps he had lost something, but he had begun to find himself. He continued walking. The rain was slowing. And this is where the story ends. Because what comes after this, whether Eliza accepted the proposal, whether Edmund truly changed, whether their paths crossed again, that is another story. Perhaps longer, perhaps more complicated. But today's story ends here. I want to keep you for just a few more minutes, though, because there's something else I want to say. Did Eliza love this man? Probably yes. During those dangerous weeks of closeness, something grew between them. Denying that would be unfair to the story. But here is the important part. What made Eliza Eliza wasn't that feeling. It was how she carried it. She carried it without breaking, without surrendering to the system. And when the door closed behind her, she kept walking forward, even with that feeling sitting in her pocket like a small stone. The truth is, Eliza didn't stay in London to prove something. That interpretation is easy and completely wrong. She stayed to survive. She stayed to be independent. She stayed so that when she woke up in the morning, she could live by her own decisions. Everything else, the mansion, Edmund appearing at the door, that final meeting, was coincidence. Life sometimes works like that. If you keep walking in the right direction, the universe occasionally offers a small piece of justice. Not something you planned, not something you waited around for, but something you were ready for when it arrived. Let me leave you with a question. Did Eliza do the right thing? She bought the mansion. Edmund apologized. Eliza accepted the apology, but she did not restore things to the way they were before. The power was hers. She carried it with grace, but she did not give it back. So what do you think? Is it harder to forgive or not to forgive? Some people think refusing to forgive is strength, carrying anger, holding your boundaries, refusing to step back. Others think the opposite, that letting go, releasing that weight, is the real strength. I think Eliza did something different. She forgave, truly and sincerely. But for her, forgiveness did not mean returning to the past. Forgiveness meant closing a door, quietly, cleanly, without hurting either side, and then opening a new one. What do you think? Write it in the comments. I'm genuinely curious. Everyone has a different answer to this question, and reading those different answers is one of my favorite parts of doing this. And finally, thank you for watching the video until the end. Your presence is my biggest motivation for telling these stories. Let me know in the comments which city you're watching from. I read every single comment, and each one means something to me. More stories are on the way. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss them. See you in the next story.